Thank
And
you so much, Matt.
I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. And again, thanks for the introduction. This is the world we live in. It would have been nice to all see you all in person, but this will make do, and I'm excited to share the next hour with you. Shelley and I from Work Matters, we're really talking about what I could contribute, and I'm gonna spend the next hour sharing some insights, some data, and some practical tips on how to what I call bridge the generational divide that we are seeing in workplaces. For those of you who've never met me before, one of the things everyone asks of me when they first meet me and they hear that bio, they say, how old are you? How is it possible that an 18-year-old has done all of that in such a short period of time? Well, I'm not 18 anymore. Unfortunately, I'm actually turning 39 in just under a month. So I am on the verge of 40. I'm an old millennial, and but this youthful complexion, although the gray is starting to come in, allows me to do a lot of interesting research with young people and get in to focus groups and to one-on-one sessions and learn from them in a way maybe that is a little more easier because I maybe I'm not as intimidating and I don't look as old as I should given my age. But I am very excited to share. And what I'm going to do today is walk you through my presentation, but I will pause at different moments throughout. And if folks have questions or comments or any point that we want to talk about, please feel free. So I'll pause and take your thoughts. But I want to start with a basic observation, which is, and this is observation existed even before the pandemic sort of upended everything that we kind of knew. But even before then, we saw the world changing very rapidly in a number of different ways. And in my mind, one way to look at this is to ask ourselves, what were and what are the largest publicly traded companies in the world? And that's, I use publicly traded because we know of what value investors subscribe to them. And what we found that if you go back to 2006, the 5 largest publicly traded companies in North America were ExxonMobil, GE, Microsoft, Citigroup, and British Petroleum. You had 2 energy companies, a conglomerate, a bank, and 1 tech company. And if you fast forward to today, the 5 largest or the 6 largest, I've taken Saudi Arabian oil company is actually number 1, but I've taken it off. And you look at the next 5, they are Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And given the pandemic, all 5 of these companies have seen their stock price, their value increase substantially. And I think that makes sense given the services and the products that they produce. But if you think about just our day-to-day lives before the pandemic and then even today, consider how many of these companies you've used already today. We might be watching this session. I'm on a Microsoft computer. I used my Apple device earlier today. I think I've already bought something on Amazon, right? And we use FaceTime and Google pretty much daily throughout the day. And to think about what these 5 companies have done, how they have changed the way we communicate, how we work, how we buy things, how we learn about our world. I think they help explain part of the phenomenon we're going to look at today, which is how do you engage and work with a younger generation, millennials, but also Gen Z even more so. I'm not going to focus on Gen Z, but they'll even more be tied to this, who grew up, who are much more instinctual in their use of these new technologies, these companies, in their day-to-day life, and bring those expectations into the workplace. And so I'm going to focus on the practical side, but I want to start this presentation by looking at sort of the theory, the big picture. And I do think that we have seen a big reset even before the pandemic. And 2 forces in the work that I do and the way that I kind of see the world are both generational change, this emergence of millennials as the largest generation in the country, in the United States and in Europe as well, colliding with intense technological change at the same time. And these 2 drivers have produced a workforce, a consumer market, a political world that has very different expectations, behaviors, and ultimately circumstances for how they go about their day-to-day lives. And understanding those 2 forces, in my mind, helps to then think about how to be better leaders, how to lead, whether you lead a team of 5, whether you are the owner or the manager or the CEO of a company of 50 or 100. How do you lead a team to be successful given this incredible change that's happening? And obviously the pandemic has I think accelerated these trends, right? I think, if we are going to be in a place where, if you are more or less office based, that your team can more or less work from home, that we would have probably got to a place where that would be possible and acceptable maybe 5 years from now, had the pandemic not happened. What the pandemic has done is it accelerated all of those trends, where home is where most of our behaviors are, where we're able to flexibly integrate work and life and do it at a pace and in a way that maybe aligns more closely with what we wanted. And so I think that's really important. So what I'm going to talk about today is what I call getting your shift together, right? And bridging the generational divide. And I'm going to spend some time in the front part talking about the theory, what I have observed, what our research says about why millennials in particular are different from older generations. I'll take a pause, we can answer some questions, and then I'm going to shift to talk about what is it you can actually do? What are some best practices? What are some tips and frames of mind to approach any problem that might or opportunity that might arise as you try to manage generational change in your workforce? Now, there's 3 things overall that I want you to take out of my talk. This is kind of the path forward. The first is, despite everything you've ever read or seen or heard about millennials, I always believe at the end of the day, generations, whether you are my grandparents' generation or now I just had a nephew last week, so he's like 6 days old. He's one of the new Gen Zers. When he grows up, we will all be far more similar to each other and to what we want out of life than we will be different. We often exaggerate differences. We kind of, treat each other, generations, like animals at a zoo, and we kind of observe them behind the glass and we're not quite sure what to make of them. I always remind folks, younger generations in particular, or older generations, if you're a millennial or Gen Z, better than you think. You've raised us, you've interacted with us, you've talked to us. And so never forget that. But the second point is that I am going to highlight some differences that I think are really important to understand, that help you explain why it is your younger workforce feels the way they do, why they behave or act the way they do, and what you can do to help reduce those gaps, reduce those perceptual differences, and create a much more inclusive, cooperative, productive team going forward. And the third point is, when we focus specifically on the workplace, I think there are some specific tips that I think come out of the learnings in the first part of my presentation that you can apply tomorrow. And I'm going to focus on what I think. And I'm going to share some of my own personal experiences. I lead a team of 7 millennials and Gen Zers. Every day, as an old millennial, I sometimes starting to feel that I don't really understand, particularly that younger cohort that's coming in. But every day I'm trying to be better, trying to create a much more millennial-friendly workplace. And the result has been, I think, not perfection by any means, but a cohesive team that kind of feels like it's working together, even during the pandemic. I do want to start, though, with stereotypes, and I want to break them down, because I do think that when you ask Canadians and survey work that we've done, how would you describe millennials? What words would you use to describe this generation? We typically find that most people don't use the most flattering terms, right? And this Time magazine article on your screen here is an example, particularly that first part of the headline, the me generation, millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents. This is the stereotype that defines my generation. And we know it, by the way. When we ask millennials, how do you think older generations feel about you? They use the exact same words. So at least there's alignment on that. And I kind of can't help but feel that millennials have this really bad brand. And that brand, even as we get older, and we're in our 30s, any of us, still sticks, right? This perception that we don't work hard, that we're narcissists, we're all about ourselves. We have realistic expectations, that we can't work well with others, right? I don't think that's true. and I'm going to, hopefully you're going to take that out from my presentation. I think every generation is unique, and every generation evolves and pushes progress forward. And I will start with the premise that, for those of you who are a little bit older than me, I think of my mom who's in her 60s. She's out of the workforce now. She's retired. But when she was starting out as a young, idealistic young employee working in her first job in, I guess, I won't give, the early 1970s, she did not want to work in a workplace of the 1940s, right? She still had to deal with many of the inequality, and as a woman, she faced a lot of systematic bias against her, but she certainly did not want to go back to the 1940s. In the same way that if you ask most millennials, they will say, I don't want to work in a workplace of the 1990s, right? And so there's this natural evolution that we're seeing in the workplace, and millennials are driving it. Now, when you look at this generation in Canada, and I think the same will be true in Lanark and Renfrew counties, in Eastern Ontario, in the province as a whole, what we see is millennials are the most, and Gen Z, if you include them, because I think they'll kind of be even more so than millennials. But millennials, as they emerged, were the most ethnically and culturally diverse generation in history, the most tech savvy, the most entrepreneurial. They're the first generation, the most educated generation, and it's the first generation in which more women will get a post-secondary degree than men. And that alone, that simple and important difference, explains so much of how this generation's psyche works, and whether you are a female or a male member of that generation, and the changing roles in households, who does what. Increasingly, women are the primary earners in dual households, and that dynamic is creating both a shift, and as leaders, we have to understand that shift and change our assumptions about our team and what they are expected to do outside of work as they get back, as they go home or come into the office or into the workplace. Now, why all the attention to this generation? Well, millennials for a long time now have been the largest generation in Canada. The current estimates, according to StatsCan, says there's almost 11 million of them, substantially higher than the second largest generation, which for 30 years was the largest generation, my parents' generation, the baby boomers. And you can see also that over time, if we look out 30 years from now, and we are right here, millennials will continue to be the largest generation over time. And it's going to continue to grow, not because there's naturally born millennials, but because of immigration that's going to continue to increase the number of those born between 1980 and 2000. And sorry, I should just note, these are the definitions I use to define these generations. So millennials are anyone born between 1980 and 2000. And the point of a generational analysis says that those born in that time period are, typically speaking, not everybody, because not everybody lived the same life or followed the same kind of pattern, but more of those 10.8 million are going to be more similar to each other than those born outside of that generation, right? So me and my cousin's now in his early 20s, we are 15 years apart in age. That's significant, right? I was entering high school as he was learning to walk. But there are still far more similarities between me and my cousin Lucas, given that 15-year gap, than me and my uncle, who's 15 or so years older than me, who's a Gen Xer and a baby boomer, and has lived very different lives, uses technology differently, and sees the world in a very different way. So we're focused on what makes those born during these periods more similar than focusing on what makes young people different from those who are older than them. I'm not looking at a life stage analysis here, or trying to understand that, because if it was life stage, then things would change as we got older. I'm looking at things that keep us similar. Now, we all seen these kind of patterns before. Millennials will be the largest generation for some time, in the same way that baby boomers were for the last 30 or 40 years. Baby boomers, that the population will decline as nature takes its hold, and as we expect, there's some certainties in life. For those Gen Xers on the call, you'll see that green line. You've been overshadowed by boomers for most of your life in terms of sheer size of that generation, and you will continue to be overshadowed both by millennials and by your kids' generation, the Gen Z, over time as well. So this is the dynamic. So it's important to understand this generation because already they make up the majority of the workforce, and in a few years they will be clearly the largest generation, and they're increasingly taking over um, management roles in organizations. They're becoming leaders themselves, and so you're seeing not just that older generations are leading millennials anymore, but in fact you've got mixed generational teams in which sometimes millennials are actually the lead, and they're leading those who are older than them. So it's creating some complexity. And so whether you're somebody who works with a millennial manager or leads a team of millennials and different generations, I think you're going to get some insight out of my presentation today. Now, very briefly, millennials, when you ask them, what do you want out of life? Um, they want pretty much the same thing that everybody else wants. What I call the table stakes of life, right? They want security, they want opportunity, they want to be respected. I think everybody of every generation always wanted to do that. Now, their expectations, as I'll argue, are probably higher, and how they live that expectation and goals will be different. But even when you ask them, do you want to get married? Do you want to have a family? Do you want to own a home? All things that I think have become part of our so-called Canadian dream are the case. What we do know, though, is they're delaying many of these things in life. That's one of the defining features, I think, of millennials, and I think will be for younger generations to come, is that we're getting married far less later in our lives. We're certainly doing it less in formal religious kinds of settings, less likely to get married in a church than I think previous generations. We want a family. We're having fewer kids, but we're also doing it later in our lives. So the average age of a woman in Canada having her first child when I was born in 1981 was 25. That was the age of my mother when she had me. Today, it's closer to 30, 31. And so that gap is also something to consider. And housing affordability, whether you live in a big city like me in Ottawa, or even increasingly, we're starting to see the pressure in surrounding regions. I know in Smith Falls, for example, with the Canopy facility, housing prices are going up, especially now in the pandemic, as people are actually looking to move farther away from big cities. Housing affordability, even in your own communities, will remain a big factor for these younger generations who still believe home ownership is something they should aspire to and can make. Now, one of the biggest differences, though, between millennials and generations that came before them is this innate sense that every day and whatever they're doing needs to make a difference in some person's life, that need to feel fulfilled, right? For some, it's about doing good in the world, right? They'll choose a career path, they'll choose a profession tied to that sense of doing good. You're going to see even more of that among the next generation in Gen Z. But even at the sort of day-to-day level, I think, because I'll show you in a minute, as how we were raised has created a generation that wants to feel that when I get up in the morning and I choose to go do something for 8.5 hours a day, that somebody in my world is going to feel that I've made a difference, that I've done something. And so everything that you do as a leader of millennials, in terms of how you engage them, the amount of work it takes to mobilize them to behave in certain ways, if you come at all of these questions with the notion that they are looking for recognition, for feedback, and for a sense of purpose, then I think you're going to be more successful going forward. And whether you are a consulting firm, whether you work in healthcare, whether you are a retailer on the main street in Carleton Place or Smith Falls, I think it's important that you think about what your purpose is, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, I do want to spend just a very brief amount of time talking about two factors that I think explain why millennials are the way they are: our upbringing, so-called helicopter parents who really changed parenting style starting in the 1980s, and then the role that technology plays. And so very quickly, right, you saw, I think, in the 80s and 90s, a real shift that has only accelerated since then, in which children became the center of attention in their families, right? It used to be you'd sort of send the kids off to do whatever. There was a dinner party, they'd be sitting at a different table, you kind of ignored them. That's how my grandparents, kind of dealt with my dad and my mom. But today, kids become the center of attention. They're invited to the adults' table. They're engaged in conversations. We ask them relentlessly, how was your day? What did you learn? How are you feeling? And so growing up with that all around us, whether it's our teachers, whether it's, our parents and our families, whether it's society more broadly, our expectation is we're always going to have a seat at the table. We're always going to be engaged in decision making, right? We learn in a range of sectors that kids, when I was growing up and kids today, have a lot more influence over the decisions that their parents or their households are making on things as trivial as like what modem are we going to use to big decisions about where we're going to go on family vacation. Like I always said, I don't think my grandfather consulted with my uncle and my dad about where the family was going to spend their summer vacation. It was more or less decided with him and my grandmother, and it was announced, and there was no give and take. Whereas today, it's likely that kids are bringing short lists of resorts and hotels, before COVID happened and we could travel, about where they wanted to go. And they might even book the trip for their parents on Expedia because, parents didn't know how to use the technology. Again, that's changed, I think, because of COVID as well. But that sense of empowerment, of having a say, of having influence over decisions is something that is unique to this generation and comes into the workplace with them. The second factor is they've also been told they're pretty special, right? And that there's a self-awareness and self esteem movement that embedded in them a sense that they not only have the ability to do great things, but in a survey we did about 5 years ago, we asked millennials in Canada, do you agree or disagree that growing up, many people told you that you could achieve anything you wanted? Not everybody agrees, but almost everybody agrees that yes, that was the state of play, that I was told I could do great things. And so there's incredible pressure, there's incredibly high expectations, and there's a sense that they can do good things. On top of that, there's now this sense, and I use this Lego piece as an example, that the world didn't really turn out like everybody said it would. Housing's incredibly expensive. Jobs seem insecure. It's harder today to get to where maybe my parents' generation got by their age. It feels that way. And in some ways, depending on your family background and your socioeconomic status, it is true. It is actually harder today to get to the same place that I think our parents were. And so when you ask millennials, do you think your generation will be better off than your parents? We now find that almost 40% say no, right? And again, I don't think that my parents' generation, the boomers, would have ever come close to feeling that way, right? That there was always this sense that every generation was going to be better than the one that came after them or before them. And that was just the nature of evolution. But with climate change and economic uncertainty and now a pandemic and global strife and Trump and you name it, there's a growing sense among young people, particularly younger members of the generation, that maybe it's going to be a tougher road. And that's going to change their thinking and their expectations around work. Not only does that upbringing obviously mean millennials are quite different from earlier generations, you also have technology, put into the mix. Millennials, as Don Tapscott described many years ago, are digital natives. They grew up with more technology in their lives than previous generations. My mother and my dad are digital immigrants, right? They are far better at using technology, particularly over the last 8 months, than they were when sort of Facebook first came out, or we started having, mobile devices, or even when we had a desktop computer in our house in like the early to mid 90s. But that doesn't mean that they will instinctively know how to use technology. And so in workplaces, we find that the desire and demand for younger generations to use the latest technology, to implement new tools, and the speed in which they expect those to happen moves far faster and is at a greater pace than what older generations expect, right? And the reason is that technology has enabled us to do more. And it's much more integrated part of our lives. So think about our need for instant reaction. Technology has created incredibly high expectations for how fast things should happen, how quickly a delivery should come. My ability to order a coffee at Tim Hortons or Starbucks on my mobile device and have it waiting for me is something that now extends beyond just the consumer market, but into the workplace, right? Our need to be gratified instantly is a relatively new phenomenon. We no longer care what experts think. It's hard to be in a position of authority because you can now be challenged because we have access to unlimited amounts of information, right? And so people in positions of authority have found that their actual authority has diminished because not only is hierarchy flatter, so we don't call each other Mr. or Mrs. and young kids today and even growing up, we were told to sort of see each other as much more equals. We were invited to the adults table. But so this decline in deference has been accelerated because technology has happened. And perhaps most important to thinking about our power as employees. At no point in history have employees had the power that they have today to influence their workplace and to almost create risk for their employer, because we have the ability to amplify good but usually bad experiences. Have high definition cameras on our phones. We have access to high speed internet at all times. And so we can capture it and share it with the hundreds of people who follow us on different social media platforms. And if you think about those social media platforms, when I was presenting, I've been presenting on this topic for years now. And I used to tell a story about my mother wanting Facebook and how my sister and I would help her get it. But Facebook is so like yesterday for particularly younger millennials and Gen Z. Like they don't even use it, right? So now it's become the platform that millennials built and Gen X and boomers adopted. But we're on one platform and younger generations and younger millennials are on others. Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. I don't even know why you would use any of those. And yet they're happening. And so this is just an example of how fast technology is changing. And different generations, when they enter, when they become adolescents and then teenagers, start using different technology. And frankly, if you don't know why you would ever use TikTok, I'm with you. Like I now feel much older because I'm in this world and this world is coming along and I'm not sure why to use it. But it's just an example of how technology changes. So all of that leads me to what I call the shift lens. And after this section, I'll pause for a moment and I can take any questions you have. But I think, when I do all the research I've done, all the thousands of interviews we've done with millennials, we do a semi-annual survey of 2,000 Canadian millennials exploring their views on a range of things. All the focus groups I've done, these 5 factors, I think, help to explain who they are and how to approach any issue or any question that you might have with them. I think they'd be helpful. The first is I think they are at heart self-educators and image-driven. 2 independent but important themes. Self-educators in the sense that we are the first generation who grew up with the internet, really, having unlimited amounts of access to information, the perception that we could figure anything out. And so training and learning on the job is very different because we have the expectation that when I need to figure out how to do something, I can figure it out, right? If I need to change a tire on a car or change a button on a shirt, I know that YouTube will have a video that will show me how to do it, right? And that's changed the psychology. We're very much on demand. And so we don't learn for things to do in the future. We learn when we need to learn to do something. At the same time, social media and growing up in a world that was far more connected, far more public, right? We're like the first generation to have almost every aspect of our life captured and shared on multiple social platforms. That's made us particularly image driven. And so a question I always ask is, what does it say about who I am that I do anything, right? And the choices I'm making in my day-to-day life are, for many, about building my personal brand, whether that's on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever platform we're on, TikTok, and Snapchat. That's so much of what we do, where I work, where I shop, what kind of car I drive. Those have always been important, but now we have a much larger audience to play to. And that audience expects us, in a way, in our minds, to keep our brand consistent and to keep building it and telling our story. We're a hopeful by birth, by bred generation, but increasingly anxious, as I've talked about. And obviously the pandemic has added a further layer of anxiety to all our lives, but in particular for young people who now feel, again, there's another hurdle to getting to the goals that they want, that the housing market, instead of going softer and more affordable, has actually become less affordable over time. These are examples of that. It's a generation that's been raised by most in their lives to say, do something you love. Life's short. Don't waste it on things that aren't important. And so impact and passion are particularly important. And demonstrating that in your workplace is critical. It's a generation that's always gotten lots of feedback from teachers, from coaches, from art and music instructors, all the way to like our social media platforms today, which gamify very, very much large parts of our life. So our likes and our dislikes and our hearts and all that kind of stuff that we get, ratings for this and that, are all part of that experience. And so at the workplace, we do expect that, and we need that. We crave that kind of feedback. And then lastly, and perhaps I'll leave it here and then we'll open it up to questions, but it's really important. We've seen an increase in transparency in all aspects of our lives over time, right? Government used to be much more secretive. Businesses were more secretive. But now we live in a world where nothing's really secret and everyone expects to, for example, know what the president of the United States is thinking at 3 a.m., even if we don't want to really know. That we now have access to people in positions of authority and power. And not only do we want transparency in why decisions are made, but in some way we expect some influence or control over those decisions, because ultimately, if they affect my life, I want ultimate control over that life. And therefore, if I feel that decisions you're making without my input, and yet they affect me, I'm going to feel defensive about those decisions. So I'm going to stress today, how do you bring your team members into the process without, workplaces are not democracies. I run a company, I'm the CEO. I by no means get my team members to vote on every decision I make, but they need to understand that your motivations and your purpose aligns with theirs, so that any decision you make, they understand why you're making it. And it's in the best interest of the team, it's the best interest of the company, and therefore it's in the best interest of them as members of that team. So I'm going to stop there, and I see that there's a whole bunch of questions coming into the chat here. Does anyone have any questions they want to share? I don't know, I wasn't watching before, but if you want to share live and turn on your camera and mic, I'm welcome to that.
Hi, David. I think there were quite a few comments going around that slide where you were talking about, how technology has changed and how we believe we're self-educators, those types of things. And there were just comments about people were identifying where they were millennials, Generation Zs, and a few of us commented on how the younger generation doesn't see the value in necessarily, like, for example, my son doesn't feel the value in going to high school. He's like, I can learn everything on YouTube. Why do I have to go to school, right? And there's some comments as well about university. I want the specific skills for work. Why do I have to spend 4 years in school? So I think those generally summarize some of the comments. And then we do have. Can you speak to how to integrate cell phones into workflows? I often hear employers commenting about phones being a distraction and not a tool for performance.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sela, and I hear that all the time, and it really depends the workplace, right? But I think most employers that you would interview or you would talk to would say, if you'd ask, show an Apple iPhone or a Google device and say distraction or tool. I think your dichotomy is really an interesting one. Most would say distraction, right? That these phones are just another way in which your teammates sort of lose focus, particularly if you're customer-facing business. If you are like a restaurant or a retailer, there's nothing worse than, as a customer, seeing someone who's not paying attention to you but is on their device, right? It's really disrespectful. And as a business owner or a manager, that, like, I know riles you up. But I also think you need to just, this is my approach to it, is I know that they are sources of distraction, but everybody has sources of distraction in their life. And so we have to manage that, right? It's no different. And I think you have to think of the device both as a tool that, if used correctly and if there's the right technology enabled, can actually enhance, the productivity, the safety, and the sort of cohesion of a team, right? And there are, depending on your business, it's hard to point to specifics, but it really depends on what kind of organization you work for. But on the other hand, we are addicted to these things. Um, and I think we all are, by the way. I don't think it's a generational thing. I think we've all become addicted to it. Like, just go into any place that has a lineup. Does anyone ever see anyone just standing in a line, kind of staring off into space anymore? No, our instinct is now to just occupy sort of dead time or waiting time with our phone, right? Looking up things, just like clicking. Like sometimes we're just like randomly looking at things. But for, I think, younger folks, for millennials, for Gen Z, but again, I think this used to be a comment I'd make, 5 years ago. I don't know if it's applicable only to younger generations anymore. Increasingly, we are connected to our world through that device, right? We learn what's going on in the news. We communicate with family and friends. And so the sense of missing out, of not being aware that something happened, or, I missed the call from a friend, or I'm part of a WhatsApp chat group and I'm missing out, is a very powerful driver of distraction. And so what I've seen in many workplaces is, if you're really hard on it, if you sort of come down hard and say you must leave your device at, in the locker, depending on your workplace. I know my wife works in a secure place, so she actually can't bring her phone into the workplace, which is easy solution for it. But you can't do that because people will think that's too heavy-handed. On the other hand, can you create safe places and safe times for people to check their phones? Create an environment where everybody agrees that this is the rules we're going to follow and this is the expectation. In the same way, if you think about when smoking rates were much higher and more people smoked, workplaces had to find a way to allow people to consume that addiction, right? It was something you had to manage. And I think finding a way to do it with these devices is important. Now, it really depends on your workplace. I've done work in like construction, and if you're driving heavy equipment, there's no safe way to look at a device while you're in that heavy machinery. On the other hand, if you are in a vet clinic or in a hospital and you're a nurse or you're a healthcare worker, there may be ways that you can create an environment that allows people to use that device.
David, we have one more question. As you mentioned, millennials have a different perspective on learning and utilize alternative education like Coursera or LinkedIn courses. Is it fair to say that employers need to be more open to those learning streams on resumes, etc.?
I think so. I think we all are learning in very different ways now. And I think, to the point that was made earlier about, and your son, Shelly, who says like, why do I have to go to high school? I can learn all of this online. I think we are seeing that like, I think the education system will evolve over time. It's going to be more competency based, right? Understanding that, yeah, the content's important, but it's not the most important thing a lot of times. Sometimes it's how we learn, it's how we communicate, it's learning to write, it's learning to present, it's learning to operate in the social setting, which is evolving over time. So I do think that there's opportunity for that. I don't know if I understand the question
Yep.
entirely.
Yeah, I think you're dead on that. It's just employers need to be more open to how people are educated on,
Yeah,
so
and
that
look,
they'll accept things on the resume, I think.
yeah, and my approach is, and I'm a consulting firm. I'm a market research company, and so I when I sort of look at what we do, I believe if we act more like a hospitality service, like a restaurant or a hotel, we are going to be better off as a company. So what does that mean? Well, I need team members who certainly have certain skills, how to, do data analysis, how to write surveys, how to analyze the data. But I also need people who have a hospitality mindset, which means they will say, I'm not going to put that I worked 20 years ago or when I was in high school at a restaurant or at a retail shop. But to me, that's really important experience. So it's about clearly articulating, even in your job ads, what are the core competencies you're looking for, so that the young people know that, some of these jobs that they might have thought were just going to pay for sort of, the bills, or a summer job to help pay for insurance or pay for tuition, is actually part of their training, because it's teaching them how to interact with people, I think is really important. And we've lost sight of that because we've pushed young people in particular to think that the degree is everything, that the or the certification, or the, that specific skill. But in fact, the most effective teammates are the ones that are much more well-rounded. We all know that. And so how do we create both job ads and job search parameters that allow us to find those right people, but at the same time, encouraging those young people to seek those skills and competencies?
I have two more questions, and then I think we'll let you go on
Okay.
again. Do millennials ever ask you how to work with older generations? If so, what advice do you give them?
All the time. I often, some of my favorite presentations and work sessions are when I actually get a room full of young people and I say, okay, here's what they think of you. But how do you help? How do you work with them? Because the same stereotypes that maybe older generations have in millennials exist the other way. And so it's always about bridging the gap or breaking down the barriers. My advice is always to put, in any situation, regardless of what generation you're from, is put yourself in their shoes.
Okay.
Understand what they're worried about, understand what they're anxious about. And for older generations, it's often that they become, and I'm not saying you are going to be irrelevant, but that fear of irrelevance is so important, particularly as technology changes so much. So how do you manage and lead a team if you're older, if you're younger, when your instinct is to move fast and to change technology and to have the latest stuff, where there's going to be resistance from older generations? That's just one example, but put
Okay.
yourself in their shoes is always my answer.
I think the last question kind of leads into what you were just saying. David, have you assessed how much older generations adapt to take on the characteristics of younger generation, and so also change the way they approach life and make decisions?
Yeah, well, I think we're still figuring it out because I think the pandemic has accelerated that. And if you're asking James, are boomers now acting and behaving and thinking more like millennials, and is that kind of convergence going to happen over time? I think it does, and I think it's been accelerated, right? So the pandemic has forced us all to live much more virtual lives, to figure out how to use Zoom, to order groceries and whatever online, all things that maybe we didn't have to do, and therefore we didn't ever learn how. But I do think that, as we enable ourselves to use certain technologies, it does change our wiring a little bit. I still don't think we're going to see complete alignment, because particularly as Gen Z, wait till you see this generation enter the workplace. They've been rewired right from the very beginning, right? That I always like showing that video of like that toddler whose instinct to change a screen is to go like this, and then you put a magazine in front of that kid and they don't know, and they go like this. They don't know how to turn a page. That's much deeper in younger people. But I do think you're seeing older generations adapt, and not just adapt, because adaptation is an active choice. I think they are evolving as the need to use this technology and the comfort level grows. There's far less difference now, I think, today between a boomer and a millennial than there was a year ago. And that's because the pandemic has forced them to be very similar in terms of their day-to-day life. Well, those are great questions. I want to end. I only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to get through this section as quickly as I can without losing the point, and leave a little bit of time for final questions. But as I'll say later, if we end at noon and you got more questions, I'll have my contact information for you to reach out to me. Happy to answer any other questions. So what's the point of this then? And I think the key question is, what can you do to make your workplace more millennial friendly? And the reason and it's not because millennials should be your only focus. So don't misstrew my question to say, if it's all about, make it all about the millennials. I mean, it needs to be, because they're going to be the largest workforce. So if you are not millennial friendly, you're more likely to lose young people. You're more likely to have a hard time recruiting, because your reputation will get around and people won't want to come and work for you, right? Your employer brand is powerful and you need to protect it. And people talk, and it's a small town and small communities, and it's easy to spread bad news. But the other reason to make it more millennial friendly is, I think I instinctively believe that every generation wants what millennials want. They just haven't ever expected it to be possible to come about, right? So in the night, again, I say in the 70s and 80s, when my mom was in her early stages of her career, I am sure there were plenty of things in her workplace, particularly as a woman, that she found horrible and unappealing at all. Yet she didn't have the confidence or the ability to demand better, right? And I think with time and with progress and with inclusion and diversity and all the kinds of things that have happened, millennials and Gen Z are now empowered to actually ask for more. And that's an important fact. So what are the 5 steps then to building that millennial friendly workplace? And these are, again, the big things. These are the high level things. The first, as I said, is I think this is true of all generations and in all workplaces. And if you're going to be a good leader, you have to have, and it's got to be clear to me, not just have it, but it's communicated and demonstrated that your motivations are sincere as a leader, that you genuinely want the very best for your team, that you feel that your efforts are trying to, not just if you're a for-profit business, be successful and profitable and achieve your financial goals, but at the end of the day, there's something bigger than just money driving you, right? That you want to grow, you want to enable others to grow. If you're a nonprofit or public sector organization, same kinds of things. You have certain metrics you're trying to meet, but are the motivations to get there and the role that you play as a leader sincere? Because I think insincerity is the first step to destroying trust. And trust, as we've talked about, is critical in any relationship, but it's particularly critical across generations because there's this natural distrust, right? That have been created by stereotypes and all of this conversation about who we are and what our differences are. That means if once you lose trust, it's really hard to build it. I just saw the quote the other day, right? Trust comes in by foot, but leaves in a Ferrari, was a quote, and I forget who said it. I just saw it on a blog post, and it's just so smart, right? Like it takes a long time to build trust, but man, once you lose it, it's gone really quickly. So sincerity is important. I'm going to stress a lot in the next few minutes about having a clear purpose. And I know in the Work Matters best practices, there's lots there about having a clear vision and mission statement. I'll talk about that in a minute. But even before you do those specific things and you articulate them, like I think every person comes into any role today and says, what's the purpose of me getting up every morning, or if I work in the evenings or on the weekends, whenever, and coming into your workplace and working for you, working with you? What's the purpose? And if there's purpose isn't clear, if it's not well defined, if it isn't continually communicated, you'll lose my engagement. You'll lose my motivation to do it, right? And so it takes a lot of work as a leader to continually communicate the purpose that each person plays on your team and the role of the team as a whole, and then maybe the role of the organization that team's in. And as a leader, I think your number one job actually is to continually communicate that purpose. Because if you do that, then everybody's on the same page. They're clear about what their role is. They're clear about what they're aiming for. And if you think about it, that's fundamentally what leadership's about: setting a goal, giving the team the tools they need to succeed in getting there, and making it easy for them to do it. And if you do those 3 things, to me, that is the essence of success. And it doesn't matter whether you are a millennial, a boomer, a Gen Xer, you're going to find success in that outlook. Now, where you do see differences, though, is the question of, are we welcome to the table? 1970s and 80s leadership styles of kind of command and control no longer work. I've done work in the Canadian military and in law enforcement. They are having to change centuries old processes where commanding officers give an order and the underling follows it without question. That doesn't work anymore. We're finding that young officers, young recruits are questioning the commanding officers, and sometimes the commanding officer doesn't know the answer about why they're giving that order because they've been told by someone higher up than them. So this notion of being welcome to the table, of having a sense of influence, not control. Like I don't think, again, business and organizations, they're not fundamentally democracies. In fact, I don't think we kind of live in a democracy really, because we don't get to have a say on every decision that governments make. But our sense of trust and dissatisfaction with government goes the wrong way when we feel that we no longer have an influence, that they're not making decisions in our best interest. And so that's why having people around the table, having representation, being inclusive and diverse on leadership teams matters, because people feel then their interests are well represented and are being included in any decision that's made. Millennials and Gen Z to come after are digital first. I think the pandemic has kind of forced us all to be digital first. So this point, when I would share before the pandemic, was I think many organizations were farther behind turning their organizations to be digital first. I think that's going to be the place. I've heard lots of anecdotal evidence and some research that's shown that when young people apply for a job and they're considering multiple workplaces, that the interview, while might be an interview between the employer and the potential employee, is often the reverse as well, where that potential employee, is trying to figure out, like, is this an employer who will embrace technology, is looking for ways to create a more seamless experience for me and our customers, or our clients or our patients or whoever it is you're serving. And so that digital first mind frame is particularly important. And then lastly, do you provide feedback and recognition regularly, right? These are core tenets of what makes, I think, a millennial friendly organization. Clear intentions, clear purpose, an openness to genuinely get people's opinions, to put yourself out as a leader. I do this. We have a retreat every year with our team. We're going to do one virtually in January now. But part of that retreat is me as the team leader, putting myself out and basically allowing everybody to tell me how I can improve and where I can make their lives better. And I cannot say a thing for the entire period. I just can take notes. I can listen, but it's a chance for my team to tell the boss what they think is working and what they think it isn't. Now that takes a lot of trust, right? And openness on my part to at times be subjected to not always the best feedback. Now, I've never been in a situation where someone has stood up and basically, like, offended me or called me an idiot or anything like that. They wouldn't do that. Like, there are some constraints on their behavior, but there's been some things that I didn't even know, and I wouldn't have known unless I created that safe space for them to share. And now they've come to expect it every 6 months. This is your moment to do it. And in a way, they know that I'm willing to listen. So they don't need to wait 6 months to tell me those kinds of things. And it allows me to solve problems faster on the team than let them kind of dwell and wait till they kind of explode. So let me just share a few final things about what I think you can start doing tomorrow with those 5 principles in mind, what I call from theory to action. The first is, and I come back to it, purpose, measurement, transparency, right? So do you articulate a clear vision and mission for your organization? Do you create purposes, even 6 months kind of goals, 6 month and an overall purpose for each member of your team, helping them develop a sense of what their purpose is? That could be a role you play. Not only do you have to then set those goals, but I think it's important to measure them. I'm a research guy, so obviously I'm going to say measurement's important. But it is important because millennials and Gen Z are going to be generations that expect transparency and expect accountability. So if you're going to say, I'm going to work harder to achieve certain outcomes, and I'm going to create goals for us, then you need to measure them, and you need to be accountable and open about them, right? And so things like doing employee surveys, check-ins, pulse studies. I do every 4 months, I do a survey of my small team. I have 7 people, but I still do a survey in which I ask them how they're feeling about work, about do they have the tools they need? Are their coworkers respectful? Is their relationship with management respectful? All those kinds of things. And then I share back the aggregate results. I don't share individual results, but I say, here's where we're doing well on, and here's where we're going to improve, and here's how I'm going to get us there. And I'm going to come back to you in 4 months, and you're all going to work together to achieve these kinds of goals. So that transparency piece is important. And I know every now and then people argue, should I share revenue targets if you're a for-profit business, or do I not want to expose too much? Look, the other thing I've learned is millennials are the most transparent and open generation I think ever. Like, you'll be shocked to know how much they share with each other. And that means, especially in the workplace, if you are paying members of your team doing the same work differently, it will come out. They will ask each other how much they make. They're not afraid to do these kinds of things. And so with transparency and openness, I think, comes better processes, comes better decisions, but that expectation is there, so you need to do it. And, I start every team meeting with 5 slides in which I walk them through our mission. This is the exact slide I show them, right? At Abacus, we help people make better decisions by providing the best insights possible in a way that drives action and storytelling. That is our mission. And so I asked them, what are you going to do this week to help drive this? Where can we improve? Where can I help you improve? What tools do you need to help our mission, right? And I always share with them, this is what I want our clients to say about us when we aren't around, right? And I'm driving it into their heads. And I just did our team survey, and I had 100% of my team say, I know what our mission is, and I know what you want us to achieve. So there's no ambiguity about what it is we are here to do. And that gives them purpose, at least. And it allows me to create a feedback loop that supports that. Focus on growth, not only in your organization, but on their personal growth, right? Millennials are going to be a generation that's naturally impatient, that wants to move up the chain quick and needs to feel that there is a path forward. So how do you communicate that? How do you demonstrate that? And how do you co-develop goals with them that allow them to feel part of the organization? And that is true in a small service-based company to a big manufacturer, right? I think you can do that. Now, all of this takes work, by the way. And I think that's going to be the lesson that comes out of my talk is if you're going to be a leader, you need to have the time to be able to do this. And so if you're a leader of leaders, if you are like the CEO of a company, then you need to enable your managers to have a little more time to be able to do this, is sort of one of the outcomes. Trust and flexibility. These are things like, how do you do that, David? Well, I think the pandemic has taught us, as an employer, that my team, it can be productive for working from home. We're almost entirely from home now. I no longer, and I never had the view that I look at my team and I say, if you're not working 9 to 5, then you're not working. I focus more on what number 4 is, which is output, not input. That's the world we're going to. Demonstrate your productivity, demonstrate that the client's well served, demonstrate that the work's getting done. And then I'm going to care less about how long it took you to do it, although I want you to do it faster, not slower. But I'm going to be less concerned about, are you sitting in your chair from 9 to 5? Are you on site from 9 to 5? Now, again, every business and every organization is different. But I do think we're moving to a management style that says, I trust you to get the job done. And I'm going to give you the tools you need to do it. I'm going to be here to support you and mentor you every step of the way, but I'm going to let you do it. And I'm going to let you own it and empower you to make that choice. I think that is the millennial way. And it's a way that we all want, but management styles are changing. Lastly, I say, as an organization, whether you're a big one or a small one, you have platforms. And I think too often organizations don't give enough kudos and credit to the team that produces the good work. I have taken it upon myself to make sure that, those that work with us, the public, our clients, and then my team themselves know that I, as their leader, care a lot about them and appreciate what they do. And I'll just show you a few examples. It's our 10th anniversary this year. And so as part of it, I've been doing kind of short interviews, getting to know my team and recording them on Zoom and then sharing them. This is me on Twitter and on our LinkedIn and with our customers. Not only do my clients get to know my team better, and it's not just about me and it's not just about my brand, but my team members feel good about it. They know that I'm putting their story forward. I'm allowing them to have a platform. And that sense of purpose and ownership and feeling like special and important, I think is very important for millennials. And any way that you can do that, in any way, doesn't have to be through Twitter or digital, but any time that you can share a little bit of the platform with members of your team, you're going to create loyalty and you're going to create, I think, a real sense. Even so, just to give you an example of my Christmas gift for part of my team this year, in Ottawa, I've got a friend, I'm going back, who does custom cookies. So this is our team and cookies. So they're going to get a whole box of cookies. But the point here is that like I see them as individuals and they're all part of that team. And while we're going to eat them all together, I constantly want to show that. So let me conclude by saying you're not a boss. There's no such thing as boss anymore. I hate that word. I hate even the word manager, right? Because manager implies you're trying to like squeeze people and manage them as opposed to enable them or empower them, right? And so for me, I think millennials and younger generations will now and forever respond better to somebody who leads as a coach than somebody who leads as a boss or a manager. And if you think about it, what a coach is somebody who is driving the entire team to a particular outcome, to win, to succeed, to meet their goals. But a coach also is somebody who is not afraid to give feedback and to, you know, point out where there's been weaknesses or mistakes made. But the coach in motivation is always improvement, is always to get it better the next time. And therefore, good coaches are those in which their players trust. They know that they have their backs. They know that they're always working for them. And I think if you approach your job as a coach and you look at your team as not working for you, but them working with us as a team, ultimately, I think you're going to be much more successful with millennials. So I will end there. I've gone a little bit over. I know there's a number of questions. Here's my contact information. Please, again, feel free to reach out